The playing fields of Ole Miss have witnessed many battles, from football to the struggle for civil rights. High in the stands at this game are two Ole Miss alumni who've been calling the plays in another epic battle.
Try, Zach. You gotta do it now.
Lawyer Dick Scruggs and Mike Moore, the Attorney General of Mississippi.
The Battle of Waterloo was won on the fields of Eton, and perhaps the Tobacco War was won at the Ole Miss Law School.
Until Big Tobacco met the boys from Ole Miss, they were undefeated in hundreds of lawsuits, and without shame before the public or before Congress.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe they're the most corrupt and evil corporate animal that has ever been created in this country's history.
This is an industry that had never been beaten, that had literally defied the judicial system and the regulatory system for decades, and yet was killing millions of people. It was just a challenge that cried out for somebody to do it. Real good play.
And this is the story of how they did it. And how in June last year, Big Tobacco made historic concessions from which there will be no turning back.
The proposal is a bitter pill because our companies have made concessions that were extremely difficult.
We wanted this industry to have to change the way they do business, and we have done that.
I'm proud of you.
Tonight on Frontline, the inside story of how two hometown boys from Pascagoula, Mississippi, took an industrial Goliath to the edge of bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, and forced Washington to finally deal with tobacco. Tobacco battle lines were redrawn in 1994 in the most unlikely of places, the Mississippi Delta town of Clarksdale. It's a town famous for a deal, but not the tobacco deal. Legend has it that the great guitarist Robert Johnson made a deal with the devil here so that he could sing the blues. And the blues sit comfortably in Clarksdale, a poor town in the nation's poorest state that has one other local hero. In the corner of the El Ranchero restaurant, they still honor the gridiron great Charlie Connerly, number 42 of the New York Giants, who went on to become a cultural icon. The first Marlboro Man.
Charlie Connerly, the Marlboro Man, was born here in Clarksdale, and it's my belief that Joe Camel died here.
Clarksdale lawyer Mike Lewis had a secretary, Alice Craven. It was a death in her family that would give birth to the idea that would bring down tobacco. In the last 30 years, 10 million Americans have died from smoking. Alice and her daughter light a candle for two of them.
My parents always smoked. It was just a part of our life, you know. It was just always cigarette butts everywhere.
Alice's father died at 44. She then watched her mother suffer 4 heart attacks. Of the 400,000 smokers who would die in 1994, Alice's mother was one of them, Jackie Thompson.
It took her about 2 hours. She just kind of laid there quietly breathing. And I unstrapped her and just laid there and held her. And until, excuse me, I just laid my head on her chest until I felt her last breath.
She was 51. And the last 5 years of her life were spent as an invalid and spent in poverty because of this disease.
Mike Lewis and his wife Pauline, also a lawyer, wanted to sue the industry on behalf of Jackie Thompson, and soon discovered that every lawsuit in the last 40 years had failed because jurors believed smokers like Jackie knew the risks they were taking. But illness rendered Jackie bankrupt, and her treatment would cost the state about $1 million. On his final visit to see Jackie in the hospital, the idea came to Mike Lewis. The taxpayer had not decided to smoke, but was paying for the consequences.
When I was on that elevator thinking about this, I was not thinking as an intellectual lawyer or anything of that nature. I was mad. Just out of the blue, it hit me that a way to get at this industry, a way to get a measure of justice, if not individually, at least as a society, would be to sue this industry on behalf of the state of Mississippi.
And then the Ole Miss connection was played. Mike Lewis is a graduate, and he turned for help to his old classmate, Mike Moore, now the Attorney General of Mississippi.
How many kids are we going to have? About 200? Good, good.
If I hadn't known him personally, I probably never would have had the courage to call him or anybody else with it.
He wondered, because she had sold everything she had and now she was on Medicaid and the state was actually spending dollars, wonder if there's a cause of action that the state could bring against the industry. And we just explored that a little bit on the phone, and I hung up the phone and I go, I don't know about that.
To check out the idea, Mike Moore turned to another Ole Miss classmate, Dickie Scruggs.
He said, Mike Lewis has just called me about an idea to sue the tobacco industry over the cost of treating his secretary's mother. The state paid the expenditures for that. And I told Lewis that, Mike said, that before he takes on something like that, he ought to get with some lawyers who have done this on a big scale before. He knew that we had enough money to fund it and that we ought to get together on it.
Dick Scruggs had millions. He had made them suing the asbestos industry over the last 10 years.
Well, I thought that was Texas.
This lifestyle was new to Scruggs. He was born poor, and when he first set up business in 1980, he couldn't afford a word processor. Now it would be his net worth, over $9 million, that would float the Mississippi lawsuit.
It would not have been fiscally responsible for state governments to risk the taxpayers' money in 1994 or 1995 on litigation like this. Attorneys general who asked their legislatures to appropriate money for this would have been laughed out of the hearing room.
No, the rule is completely invoked.
Based on the promise that he would be paid only if they won, and then at a rate set by the court, without a written contract, on the strength of a handshake, these two friends from Pascagoula declared war on tobacco, an industry that had vanquished every plaintiff and politician who had ever tried to bring it to account.
AMF.
My parents thought I was nuts, filing a lawsuit against the tobacco industry. My best friends told me that this would be the last political thing that I'd ever do in my life.
So this was Mississippi madness.
You know, you could say it was madness, but it was more damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
Dick Scruggs would bring more than money to the Attorney General's arsenal. He had connections, personal connections. His wife, Diane, has a sister who is married to a political heavyweight. Chester Trent Lott, the Senate Majority Leader, is another boy from Pascagoula and another Ole Miss grad. He is also Dick Scruggs' brother-in-law.
I don't want anybody to know.
I don't want to know that.
And Trent Lott, in turn, would give Scruggs a critical introduction to his advisor and political pollster, Dick Morris.
Trent had a weird relationship with Scruggs. He would always refer to Scruggs as my no-good scum-sucking brother-in-law. He kind of saw Scruggs as sort of this crazy liberal who he was related to by marriage. who he liked a great deal. He had a very real affection for him.
Dick Scruggs' partner in the asbestos litigation was South Carolina lawyer Ron Motley, one of the most successful trial lawyers in the country. He had personal reasons to join up again. Motley's mother died of emphysema after decades of smoking.
When you hear the denials of the cigarette companies that they had never caused the illness or death of a single American citizen, having sat there and watched my mother suffocate and having the doctors tell me and describe for me exactly what caused it, how it caused it, and what it was doing to her, it makes you very angry. At least it made me very angry. And when I get angry, I try to get even.
The chance to get even came on May 23, 1994.
The state of Mississippi filed suit today against 13 tobacco companies, along with...
After a year of preparation, Attorney General Moore's suit wound up in the Pascagoula court of Judge William Myers, coincidentally another graduate of Ole Miss.
Your 5 friends who went to the University of Mississippi, the judge in the case, Trent Lott, like a Mississippi mafia.
You know, we planned this case to be in Pascagoula, Mississippi, our hometown. We would know if the tobacco companies did anything untoward down there. We were sure that they would. So we tried to get every advantage we could get.
Home cooking.
Well,
home cooked them. Yeah,
we hoped that the frying pan was going to be very, very hot for them.
Well, about time with the coffee.
And they would keep the heat up by providing a safe haven for the 2 most important whistleblowers in the history of the tobacco wars, a corporate vice president and a lowly clerk who would liberate the most damaging documents to ever emerge from inside the industry.
Some of the best.
Merrill Williams was a paralegal for Brown & Williamson Tobacco's lawyers. Outraged by what he read in their secret files, Williams covertly copied thousands of documents, and then he stole them.
I took information from 1988, starting late in '88, became very bold, and in Christmas I had a whole suitcase I just took out.
The documents contained admissions by the makers of Viceroys and Cools that nicotine is addictive, that tobacco is linked to diseases, and that tobacco lawyers kept secret information that was vital to the public health. For several years, Williams tried to get his documents out, but no one he contacted in the anti-tobacco movement was willing to touch them for fear of retribution. So he turned to Ralph Nader's organization and Nader's lead counsel, Alan Morrison.
Everybody would be running substantial risks, perhaps even us, because we knew that these had been taken from lawyers' files.
And so no lawyer would volunteer to represent Williams in his effort to get out his 4,000 pages of documents.
Alan Morrison could not find a pro bono, an attorney, in the entire area of his expertise, and he knew people in corporate law who did this kind of thing. Why? Because it was tobacco.
And in addition, of course, or perhaps I should say, Paramount, Merrill Williams, of course, had no money to pay any of these lawyers. So we were asking somebody to take on a difficult, high-risk task for no money.
Isolated, unemployed, the subject of a lawsuit by Brown & Williamson and its lawyers, gagged by a Kentucky court, Williams was desperate. Then he met Dick Scruggs.
He looked like warmed over death when we met him. He looked unkempt, not quite like he'd been sleeping under a bridge, but close to it.
Merrill Williams's poverty and isolation ended in Mississippi. Dick Scruggs arranged housing, a car, and a boat. And of course, Williams handed over the precious stolen documents.
I helped Merrill Williams. Didn't buy him these things. These were in essence loans that I made to him, and he has, at the time, agreed to repay me one day for that, and I hope he will. I trust that he will. I can understand how it might look like it was some sort of a payoff, but it wasn't.
I guess the question is, with Merrill Williams, you You knew that he did not come by these documents through a legal process.
I disagree with that.
Well, it made a whole bunch of other people real nervous. I mean, people who are dedicated anti-tobacco activists wouldn't even go near him.
When you catch someone in the process of committing a crime or a fraud on the public health, and you don't make that public, I think that's the crime.
If you raise your right hand, do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I saw with my own 2 eyes 7 tobacco executives raise their right hand and swear.
I believe nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And then the very next couple of weeks, I had in my hand a memo that proved that they were lying. When Merrill Williams showed me that first document from Addison Yeaman, the famous 1963 memo, I was astonished. I mean, I was amazed. I knew what I had in my hand right there was enough, I thought, to put some chief executive officers of the tobacco industry behind bars.
Armed with boxes of documents, Moore and Scruggs headed straight for the Capitol and the offices of Congressman Henry Waxman, who had chaired those memorable hearings.
You told him they were basically stolen documents.
I think that we didn't tell him so much that they were stolen documents, but that we had received them through a whistleblower. I think it was implied that they were stolen documents.
He didn't dive into the box.
Well, no, he didn't. It was almost as if they were radioactive. I mean, he wanted to embrace them, but at the same time, he was afraid of them. It was like almost a physical reaction. But he, after some initial discussion, he then asked us to meet with his staff. And his staff proceeded to go through them like a hungry lion. They were amazed at the documents.
Within days, the documents would leak out of Congress. First, excerpts appeared in the New York Times. Then someone from Mississippi, calling himself Mr. Butts, sent them to the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco and into the hands of longtime anti-tobacco activist Professor Stan Glantz.
The lawyers who've come into this case have done the public a great service because they've come in and had the courage and the wherewithal to take the industry on its own terms. And I think that the activities of these lawyers really points to the really inadequate job that the public health community's done on this issue for the last 40 years.
The university scanned the documents onto the internet. Once secret papers were now public and were now admissible in court.
And somehow, through your delivering them to Washington, they wind up on the internet.
That's right. That's right.
And eventually they do become admissible.
Right. Well, we were not sorry to see that happen.
Then the Food and Drug Administration got its hands on them. A few months before, the FDA administrator had launched an investigation into tobacco and nicotine and what the industry knew about its health effects.
In our wildest dreams, we never thought we would find documents that would say, we're in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. And it was then, and it was only then, that I realized that we were really crossing a bridge and that we couldn't go back.
The FDA would be further helped by Scruggs' other whistleblower, Dr. Jeffrey Wigand, a former vice president of Brown & Williamson, the highest level defector to ever emerge from inside Big Tobacco. On November 29, 1995, at Dick Scruggs' home in Pascagoula, Jeffrey Wigand faced a critical decision. That day, he was scheduled to give evidence in a Mississippi courtroom, while back home in Kentucky, he faced jail if he revealed what he knew about his former employer. Wigand's life was already coming apart. Shadowed by bodyguards because of death threats, he was being sued by Brown & Williamson for speaking out. Like Merrill Williams, no one would come forward to defend him except Dick Scruggs.
I was feeling guilty about it.
In Pascagoula, Jeff Wigand spent the night in Dick Scruggs' home, protected by armed guards.
You were really scared?
No, I wasn't scared physically. I was scared of the consequences of what might happen to Jeff.
I came down here, yeah, I was going to go ahead and do it. I mean, the guards that night, sweeping the house for bugs, I mean, and then just getting the stark realization of what could happen. I mean, the concept of going to jail really scared me.
And Dick Scruggs understood the risk Wigand was taking.
I told Jeff that there was a good possibility that when he got back to Kentucky that night or the next day, that if he testified in Mississippi, that the judge in Kentucky would put him in jail for contempt of court, and that they would plague him to the gates of hell for giving this deposition, and that if he wanted to back out and not do it, it was not too late to back out.
Dickie then said, you know, you can be off the hook if you want. There's nothing lost. We understand and we'll understand. We change nothing. And I guess I came out here and Dickie was at the door and I said, fuck it, let's do it.
I'm sorry, we can't talk about this morning right now.
Waiting inside the courtroom was Ron Motley.
There's a lot of jostling for position, a lot of shouting by the media. Bedlam best describes what was going on inside.
Just a moment.
This is the videotape of Jeffrey Wigand's deposition, the first time it's ever been broadcast. The voices are those of 30 tobacco lawyers trying to plug the leak.
Order doesn't say that.
Well, order does not say it either. Rules say you can.
Order doesn't say that. Yeah, you do. This is a sealed deposition. Order does not say
Doesn't make any difference.
Well, show me where it says it, Joe.
Well, show me where it doesn't say it.
At one point in time, I actually told them, why don't they just go ahead on outside and I'd finish the deposition by myself with Dr. Wigand.
Sir, if you continue to disrupt this, I'm just going to walk up there close and let him state his answer in the record, and whether you hear it or not, I care not. Now, will you please tell me so I can hear what your answer is?
Brown and Williamson preserves all...
Would you please repeat the question?
Yeah. Did they change the minutes?
Yes, they did.
Did they eliminate 12 pages of the minutes?
Roughly 12 pages of the minutes.
I've never seen anybody take control like that before. Normally, in those situations, the industry always controlled and overpowered.
Sir, are you familiar with the term called document management?
The former vice president of research would describe how his company altered and hid scientific documents and explain how they boosted nicotine's impact on the brain.
Despite use of ammonia compounds,
He would go on to accuse his former boss, Thomas Sandifer, of lying before Congress.
Do you see what he said, sir?
Yes, I do.
He says, I do not believe that nicotine is addictive. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Is that the opposite, contrary to what he has expressed to you numerous times?
That is correct.
And then Jeffrey Wigand would reveal how Brown and Williamson Tobacco genetically engineered tobacco plants and then illegally shipped the seeds to Brazil.
Seeds were harvested in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. They were taken out when it was knowingly when it was illegal to take them out and bring them to Sousa Cruz to be grown.
Listening in the courtroom was a Justice Department prosecutor. Wigand's testimony would now give substance to a separate federal criminal investigation of the industry.
They spent $20 million on me in terms of what their total legal action against me. And they probably could have paid me off for a hell of a lot less and then never created the monster they created.
Wigand now had some protection because he was a federal witness. And for months, Wigand had been secretly helping another government agency. He had agreed to help the Food and Drug Administration in their investigation on condition that he be known only by his code name, Research.
I was sitting there in my conference room, and I was talking to one of the most important people we would talk to during our investigation. And I knew him only by his code name. I knew him as Research. And I'm sitting there one day, and I'm looking at documents, and I'm saying, who's this person, who's that person? And then I go, who's Jeffrey Wigand? And he looks at me and he says, I'm Jeffrey Wigand.
Jeffrey Wigand would help the FDA sort through thousands of industry documents. But David Kessler knew that in order for the FDA to regulate nicotine, he would need more than just scientific evidence. He would need political muscle.
It's one thing when a regulator goes out and says nicotine is a drug. It's another thing when a regulator and a president of the United States makes that statement.
And that is where Dick Scruggs would play a surprising backroom role. His connection was his advisor in the tobacco war, Trent Lott's friend, Dick Morris, who is now engineering the president's re-election.
I knew from my polling in Mississippi how strongly people in what's, after all, the most conservative state in the country felt about that issue. So I told the president that I thought this could be a really good issue for us to focus on.
But did he bring up the fact that, hey, Dick, tobacco, they're the Darth Vader of politics?
Good. Well, he was scared to death of losing Kentucky and losing Tennessee. But I kept telling him that even in those states, there was probably a strong majority in favor of banning tobacco companies' efforts aimed at kids. And the contribution that I guess I perhaps had the most to do with was to say that voters felt one way about kids and teenagers and another way about adult smoking.
The Mississippi boys back channel to the White House reported that the president needed persuading if he was going to back the FDA.
Dick asked me if I would pay for a poll to see just what the public attitudes in the tobacco states were toward youth smoking and presidential intervention in that area. And I said, of course, if that's what's needed, do what you need to do, and I'll be more than happy to pay for it.
So I did a survey in 5 states, and we found that in every single one of those states, he gained by taking this position, as long as it was aimed at kids, at teenagers. And he was shocked by that. He was absolutely blown away by that.
Today, I am announcing broad executive action to protect the young people of the United States from the awful dangers of tobacco.
Bill Clinton would be the first president to challenge big tobacco. Emboldened by this growing tide of political support, the Mississippi boys set out aboard Scruggs' private jet to forge new alliances and persuade more states to sue. One state that wasn't going along with them was Minnesota, where Attorney General Hubert Humphrey had launched his own assault on tobacco.
This morning, we filed a historic lawsuit charging the tobacco cartel with conspiracy, consumer fraud, and antitrust violations.
Under the leadership of fiercely independent trial lawyer Mike Cerisi, using their own documents, Minnesota made its own case, separate from Mississippi.
How important has their case been to you?
Not at all. It hasn't been important to us at all. I mean, it's a different case. I think it's been important to the entire litigation, just as our case has been important to the entire litigation. But has it been important here in Minnesota? No.
Would you give any credit to Mike Moore, for instance, for advancing the anti-tobacco cause?
Oh, absolutely. I think that Mike Moore is a promoter, and that's what he did. He went around the country promoting the lawsuit. He got a lot of other attorneys general to get involved down the road. And, you know, in a situation like this, you sort of need a barker. And he was the carnival barker. He was out there promoting the case.
And Dick Scruggs?
He's his lawyer.
The barker and his lawyer gathered some allies. By the spring of 1996, they were joined by West Virginia, then Florida, then Massachusetts, and finally Louisiana.
I tried to twist arms if I could, tell them how much proof we had, because I knew the political pressure involved in this. I mean, suing the tobacco industry is not a smart political move, especially back then.
Because?
Because they come after you, and they did. They sent former attorneys general hired as lobbyists, every attorney general in this country. They sent business representatives, industry representatives, not just tobacco, but whatever state it was in. In Louisiana, they sent the chemical industries and the oil industries to see the attorney general and said, you better not do this or we're coming after you, you know. It's bad for business. I mean, in my own state, my governor sued me.
Governor Kirk Fordyce shoots his own smoking gun at Attorney General Mike Moore's smoking lawsuit.
This is not an attempt to take the side of the tobacco companies. Instead, it is simply an attempt to stop an improper action by our state's Attorney General.
He ought to be put on the billboard as the new Marlboro man.
He filed a lawsuit directly in the Supreme Court on one day. Tobacco companies filed the same lawsuit against me the very next day. So I had this huge industry and the governor of my state fighting me in my Supreme Court with 9 judges and my case hanging in the balance. If they had dismissed my case, I was history.
But Scruggs and Moore were about to make a breakthrough. They flew around the country to a series of clandestine meetings with the CEO of a tobacco company. He was an outsider in the world of big tobacco who had taken control of the Liggett Group. Wall Street operator Bennett LeBeau.
I mean, recognize that Liggett is the smallest of all the tobacco companies. I also, from a financial point of view, said to myself, we can't afford to lose even one lawsuit, one Medicaid case. We'd go immediately bankrupt.
In addition, LeBeau could cut a good deal for his company by getting in first, so he dropped a bombshell on Wall Street.
For the first time, a cigarette company is breaking ranks with the rest of the tobacco industry and agreeing to settle a smoking-related lawsuit.
Wall Street said, what did you do? This is insane, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth, Lowell, is I didn't believe the strategy these tobacco companies were following.
So did you notify your allies in the tobacco industry that you were about to defect after 30 or 40 years of a united front?
Absolutely not. They all read about it in the Wall Street Journal on, that day when it was announced.
It was a major event, I would say. It was a major event in the process that led us to June 20, 1997. That I think, as I said earlier, there are a number of things that came together. And certainly the Liggett settlement was a part of that.
And I think when Liggett actually settled, agreed to pay money, it was earth-shaking because it validated the lawsuits. It showed that they did have merit. And I think that encouraged other attorneys general to get into the fight. And it started the walls crumbling.
And the Liggett settlement would also bolster the federal criminal investigation. A few steps from the White House, dozens of FBI agents and 12 prosecutors had been assigned to a special task force based in this building.
We're cooperating completely with the Justice Department.
So when you say you're, in a sense, turning over evidence to the attorneys general, you're also turning over evidence to the Attorney General of the United States.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The heat from the Justice Department was causing tobacco executives like Thomas Osdeen, Philip Morris's longtime research director, to fear for their future.
Did you become director of research?
On advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination.
Back in Mississippi, those suits by the governor and the tobacco industry against Attorney General Mike Moore had been dismissed by the state Supreme Court.
It took a year of effort to beat that lawsuit, but when they lost that, they were history. I mean, when the Supreme Court of my state said this trial will go forward, they were through, and they knew it.
Well, that was certainly a setback.
A setback that within a week knocked $9 billion off Philip Morris's stock. And Ron Motley had another surprise in store for the industry. He persuaded judges in upcoming trials in Florida and Texas that he could sue, not just for Medicaid recovery, but charge them with racketeering. To make the case, Motley hired Professor Robert Blakey, a former federal prosecutor and the author of RICO, the federal racketeering law. These charts that he prepared for trial would cast the tobacco industry in the same light as the mafia.
In the 1930s, the 22 families put together a national organization. What they did is they had 9 families in the center as a commission that would be like a cartel for organized crime, organizing all of the family business, settling all the disputes, running organized crime through this central organization. That's the organization of organized crime. This is the organization of the tobacco industry. The manufacturers around here competing in the sale of cigarettes, but colluding in a scheme to defraud, orchestrated by the lawyers in the center, a bogus group doing research, and then a PR group putting the message out. The Committee of Counsel is the mechanism that organized the scheme to defraud.
The Committee of Counsel included a lawyer representing each company. Steve Parrish of Philip Morris was at one time chairman.
We interviewed G. Robert Blakey. He describes the Committee of Counsel to us as almost like a conspiracy of consigliere from a mafia family, getting together to make policy designed to deceive the American people.
Could not disagree with that more. Don't know what else to say.
Did you in these meetings attempt to steer research in certain directions that would help the industry and obfuscate the scientific debate?
In the limited time that I attended those meetings, we got together to discuss common legal issues to the industry.
Did it have anything to do with scientific research projects?
I'm sure there were discussions of scientific research. One of the key
special projects.
One of the key things that is a part of the smoking and health litigation is the science that people use to claim that cigarette smoking makes people sick. So I'm sure there was discussion about that.
This document states that research programs have not been selected against specific scientific goals, but rather for various purposes, such as public relations, political relations, and position for litigation.
The lawyers, not the scientists, designed the research. The lawyers decided what was to be disclosed publicly about the research. They orchestrated a fraud and a crime.
They were facing bankruptcy, some of them, in the Texas case because the damages for Texas were so great, and we were going under RICO. They faced punitive damages too.
Isn't there the threat that you may lose 1, 2, 3 of these multi-billion-dollar judgments and have to go into bankruptcy?
Sure, that would be a terrible thing.
The stock you own in the company would be worthless.
It would not be worth much.
If these tobacco companies go bankrupt, new tobacco companies will spring up from the ashes. So what would happen in the event of a bankruptcy is far worse than bringing this industry under control and making them comply, because then, following a bankruptcy, the new tobacco companies would be totally free of any of the liabilities for the misdeeds of this industry. Totally free.
Mike, you ready on the main? You ready, Jack? He's the chip. He's everything. He's.
In the spring of 1997, Scruggs was on the course towards a face-off in court.
Go, hoist, get it up. Hoist, hoist.
He knew he had the advantage. He had 40 states on his team. His opponents were floundering. But he couldn't afford to kill them. For a contingency lawyer, the obvious tactic was to settle. The opportunity came from an unexpected place. Bill Clinton had assigned his close advisor, Bruce Lindsay, to tobacco. He was listening to the industry's overtures.
I got a call from Bruce Lindsay, and Bruce said that the president wanted us to at least meet with the tobacco industry. At that point, we weren't wanting to meet with them. You know, we were trying to hold off meeting with them because we just didn't believe, we didn't trust them. But when, you know, the president of the United States, through Bruce Lindsay, tells me he wants me to meet with the industry, I mean, who am I to say, no, I'm not going to? So I called Scruggs and I said, Scruggs, we got to change the plan here. We need to meet with them.
On the 3rd of April, 1997, Moore and Scruggs would come face-to-face with the Marlboro Man's boss, Jeffrey Bible, CEO of Philip Morris, and his counterpart at RJR, makers of Ritz crackers and Winston cigarettes, Stephen Goldstone.
These are some folks who've done some bad things, and you know, I'm walking in the room shaking hands with them, and you know, the usual nice things, gestures that you do, and glad to meet you, etc. And I don't know if I was glad to meet them or not, but I was glad they were there.
We didn't know how people were going to react to us, what the emotional state of everybody in the room was going to be. So I think there was a fair amount of tension, a fair amount of apprehension.
What the industry was looking for was immunity from future lawsuits.
They wanted the kind of limitations on liability that we just weren't going to give them. They wanted total immunity from civil liability for individual cases, for class actions, punitive damage, everything. So it was a huge, frustrating, fighting battle.
The industry was prepared to make a surprising offer up front. They would agree to give up their right to advertise their product. It was a concession the attorneys general knew they would never get in court, because Big Tobacco had for decades successfully defended its First Amendment right to free expression.
When we early on indicated a willingness to give up billboards all across the country, that they realized that we were there in good faith and that we were serious and we really wanted to try to work something out.
The industry was also prepared to offer an astounding amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars. Not only would they retire Joe Camel, but vending machines would go. And in a contentious look-back provision, the industry would face fines if youth smoking did not decline.
The look-back provision of the June 20th agreement is one of the most, I believe, unfair parts of the agreement, because it penalizes us if youth smoking doesn't decline, even though we may not be the ones at fault. And I think if there's one thing we could all agree on, it is that despite what people think of the tobacco industry, that the tobacco industry is not the only player in this in the decision as to whether a kid's going to light up a cigarette.
But in return, the companies would be protected from punitive damages for past behavior and from all class action suits. There would also be a cap on any future damages. By June 20th, 1997, Mike Moore and the other attorneys general had a deal. For settling their suits, the industry that had never paid out a dime would hand over $368 billion. It had taken 4 years.
It's been a long, hard struggle. I won't tell you that this is the end. This is really the beginning of the end for the way the tobacco industry has treated the American public and probably the people in this world.
That day, Scruggs and Moore drove to the White House with their deal. For it to take effect, it needed legislation and presidential approval. But they were about to discover some bumps on that road.
The first disappointment we had, though, was that we were told that within 10 days, actually we were told that on that day, a positive statement would be forthcoming from the White House. That didn't work out like that. 2 weeks went by, 4 weeks went by, 8 weeks went by.
The President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
Even though the White House had had daily briefings throughout the settlement talks, there were those backstage who now argued for a tougher deal.
Today, I want to challenge Congress to build on this historic opportunity by passing sweeping tobacco legislation.
Mike Moore would now be pushed onto the defensive.
Scruggs and Moore were so used to fighting the tobacco companies that they were unused to fighting a two-front war. The tobacco companies in front of them and the public health community in the rear. Because the public health community basically said, thanks for the gains, now get lost. We want to kill these guys. We don't want to make a deal with them.
Why a settlement? Well, the word... Why do you want a settlement? Why not legislation? Why not enact comprehensive legislation that's aimed at reducing the number of young people who smoke? Why do you need a settlement? Why do you need to give the industry immunity?
I thought it was horrible. I thought it was premature. I thought it was a sellout. I thought that this was the beginning of the divergence of the public interest and the interests of these lawyers, and that it was a mistake.
We could kill the industry, and we could kill them. I mean, I don't have any question in my mind that we could have killed them. We could have put them out of business, and we still can. If this settlement doesn't go forward, the industry will be killed. There's no question in my mind. The state's lawsuits will put the industry in bankruptcy. There will be no money whatsoever, and there may not be this particular tobacco industry, but guess what? Out of the ashes will rise ABC tobacco industry with no past misconduct and no liability whatsoever. Therefore, they won't have to pay a penny. Or we could call a peace, if you will, make them change the way they do business, make them quit hurting our kids, and make them pay for the sins of the past. And that's what we chose to do.
I think the way to beat the tobacco industry is to beat the tobacco industry. You know, it's not easy, but it's possible. And you do it one step at a time.
This is what Stan Glantz wants. The tobacco companies dragged into court state after state. Minnesota didn't sign on to the June 20th deal, and so Mike Cerisi took the first state case to trial.
If you prevail in Minnesota, what will you want?
We want actions of the industry to stop. We want remedial actions to take place. We want to prevent, to the greatest degree possible, the opportunity for youth to start smoking.
You sound just like Mike Moore.
I don't think I do.
Well, he says we don't just have money.
Well, then what's he doing out being a paid lobbyist for the industry promoting this June 20th settlement? I'm not promoting the June 20th settlement. He is. So please don't tell me I sound like Mike Moore in terms of what I want to take place in this litigation, because I don't. We're a sea apart.
When people say today that you've become, in a sense, their life preserver, that the settlement is their way to survive and profit, and you're now their lobbyist, it's true then.
No, I promise you, the only people that I lobby for are the people, men and women of this state and the children of this country. Just think from whence we came and where we are now. Where we were is we had an industry who wouldn't tell the truth, refused to admit their products caused disease, and marketed specifically to our children, right? Now we've got an industry who, by law, has to tell the truth and will be made to tell the truth, can't market to our children, and is paying for the health care costs for the damage that they do.
On Dick Scruggs' desk is a deposit slip, the first installment of Mississippi's settlement with the tobacco companies. It's for $170 million. While Congress tries to come up with a national deal, 3 states have settled. Mississippi for $3.4 billion, Florida for $11.3 billion, and Texas for $14.5 billion. Scruggs and Moore have forced Washington to deal with tobacco. Each week they fly into the Capitol to push for a national deal. And the going can get pretty rough.
The subject of our hearing this afternoon is what role, if any, Congress should play in determining the amount of attorney's fees to be recovered.
There's no shortage of skeptics and critics.
We know the contingency fee is controversial, and human nature being what it is, no one really objected. There weren't hearings like this when these contracts were entered. Everybody thought this was so risky that these lawyers must be nuts if they would take this industry on a contingency fee. There were no objections to it of any consequence. It's only, and that's human nature, it's only when the rats are out of town that people decide that the Pied Piper didn't earn his money.
Because he and Motley represent the majority of the states, Scruggs could make hundreds of millions of dollars.
Can't speak for all our colleagues, but we are willing to go to the arbitration system to have an independent panel of 3 arbiters decide how much money we make, and we intend to urge that on our colleagues, our co-counsel in other states, and have produced the most results.
On the other side of the Hill, his critics have paid frequent visits to the senator who is now in charge of trying to pass legislation, John McCain.
I've been working very closely with Dr. Kessler, with these organizations that advocate a tobacco-free environment for kids, because look, whether I happen to like it or not, these people are the referees. And if we come up with a proposal that they attack, maybe not all of them, but the majority of them attack, then we're not going to get any legislative result here.
Order, and we'll take our seats.
Last month, Senator McCain's Commerce Committee approved a bill that eliminated almost all of the immunity that Scruggs and Moore had negotiated and jacked up the industry's total bill to $515 billion. The response from the industry was immediate and unambiguous.
The extraordinary settlement reached on June 20th last year that could have set the nation on a dramatically new and constructive direction is dead.
Stephen Goldstone of RJR was signaling that the public health community had pushed a step too far. Big Tobacco wasn't going to pay $500 billion and get virtually nothing in return. But down the street at a federal courthouse, events were unfolding that the industry could not walk away from. While the news crews waited to stake out the witnesses in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, no one recognized the man arriving to testify before another grand jury, Nick Brooks, CEO of Brown & Williamson Tobacco.
Have you been questioned by the Department of Justice?
No, I have not.
Have people from Philip Morris been subpoenaed before the grand jury?
We have been cooperating with the Justice Department's investigation. We've said that publicly, and that's all we're prepared to say.
You're not aware that certain CEOs and executives at other companies have been subpoenaed before the grand jury?
As I said before, we are cooperating with the Justice Department in its investigation, and we're not prepared to say anything further.
Frontline has learned that Brown & Williamson has been notified that it is a target of the grand jury and can expect to be indicted. The charges are based in part on information that was provided by Jeffrey Wigand in that Pascagoula deposition back in 1995. And as of June 20th, 1997, tobacco industry spokesmen have changed their tune on at least one key issue.
You believe nicotine is addictive?
Do I personally? Under the definition that people apply today, I certainly do believe it is addictive.
Tobacco enjoyed a charmed life in American politics, and the assumption was that you could never take them on. Remember the old stuff about Jim Brown, you don't spit on Superman's cape, you don't walk on Superman's cape, you don't spit into the wind, you don't mess with the Lone Ranger, and you don't fool around with Jim. Well, that's how people, I think, felt about the tobacco companies. And the irony of it was that it took a pygmy to take them on because the giants were too scared.
Nice to meet you.
Moore and Scruggs are still selling their agreement, convinced that all the sides are posturing.
I want to say hello and thank you, sir, for your courtesies.
Thank you for coming up to see us.
Last week, Minnesota settled its case, and now Scruggs believes that for everyone else, the stakes are so high that no one can afford to walk away from a deal.
It's not often in life that you have a chance to make a mark on humanity, and we all got caught up in the opportunity that this presented to us, not only to make a lot of money for our clients and perhaps for ourselves, but to really make a difference in the world.
For more of this report, check out Frontline Online. Take a closer look at the criminal case and what damaging internal tobacco documents show. The depositions, never-before-seen excerpts from the intensive questioning of the CEOs. A special report on who loses if Big Tobacco goes bankrupt. A challenging quiz on tobacco ads and marketing at Frontline Online at www.pbs.org.
Next time on Frontline,
Special Watergate prosecutor Archibald
once
Cox.
they were heroes.
Should be followed wherever it may. I shall resign.
Now they're
I'm
not.
not going to comment on